Flight disasters are something that haunt all of us. Even if you don't have a fear of flying, every time you see the steward doing their safety demo, it's not unusual for it to cross your mind. What if this is the flight that goes down? In this video, we'll be going through one of the most notable civilian air crashes of all time, and the horrific things those who survived the crash had to do to stay alive. It's the Andes flight disaster. So, here we go. On October 13, 1972, the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 took off from the Carrasco International Airport located in Montevideo, Uruguay. The flight was on a journey to Santiago, Chile, and had 40 passengers and 5 crew members on board. The passengers consisted of 19 male rugby players and their families and supporters, members of the Old Christians Club rugby team. This was a special chartered flight by the Uruguayan Air Force specifically for the rugby team for their match in Chile. The pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, was quite experienced in flying over the Andes mountain range in South America, one of the largest mountain ranges in the world. He had flown over this mountain range over 29 times in his career. That included the same model plane, the Fairchild F-27, as this flight. In short, the passengers were seemingly in very safe hands. Unfortunately, sometimes nature conspires to throw something at you that no amount of experience can surpass. During the flight, at around 5,500 meters in the air, there was a lot of cloud cover. This prevented the pilots from being able to confirm their exact visual location. They couldn't see by looking out the window where they were, so they fell back to relying on the aircraft's radar. This indicated that they were near the city of Curacao. It was wrong. The plane was actually over 70 kilometers away from that town. The pilots had notified air traffic control that they would be approaching soon, and normally this would have taken 11 minutes from the Plancon Pass, but they gave the notification within 3 minutes of reaching it. I want to say oops here, but it sort of makes what follows less dramatic, so major oops. The pilot requested permission to descend, and air traffic control, not knowing that the flight was precariously close to the Andes, granted permission. As soon as the flight began its descent, the plane suffered extreme turbulence. Initially, the passengers took it quite lightly and even joked about their ordeal. Turbulence happens, and having a giggle sometimes is the best medicine. Not in this day, though. As the clouds flew past the window and began to clear out, the Andes Mountains seemed to its passengers and crew to be very, very close to the plane. And suddenly, laughter turned to panic. The pilots tried to apply full force in an attempt to ascend out of the mountains, but instead ended up hitting them, causing irretrievable damage to the plane itself. The pilots tried to fly the plane over the mountain ridge, or at least bring the nose of the plane above it to prevent the tail from exploding, and to an extent it worked, but the plane's right wing and tail cone were heavily damaged by the collision. Eventually the tail cone was separated from the plane, and along with it, it took the fuselage of the plane. As the tail cone separated, 2 rows of the back seat flew out of the plane, taking the lives of 5 people on board, including 3 passengers, a stewardess, and a navigator. After the plane managed to ascend about 200 more meters, the left wing struck another mountain and 2 more passengers fell out the rear of the plane. All the others could do was watch and cling on tight for their own lives as they were struck by debris. Eventually, the flight crashed into a snowbank, immediately killing the pilot, Ferradas. The co-pilot was crushed inside the cockpit but was still alive. Additionally, 3 other passengers died from the impact of the plane hitting the snow. All of the remaining seats on the plane were ripped out and crashed to the front of the plane, leaving the surviving members in a heap of broken bones, damaged organs, and surrounded by their dead family and friends. Within the hour of the flight going missing, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service began its search. However, as the flight had deviated from its communicated path by about 45 miles, this was a tougher challenge than usual. Initially, they thought that the flight had crashed into an area that would be accessible to aircrafts and helicopters, and the air search and rescue services desperately tried to find the plane and its passengers. Eventually, as the search widened in the following days, they had brought the actual crash site into their coverage, but failed to locate it because of the amount of snow. Out of the initial 45 people on board, 33 people still remained alive after the crash. The co-pilot, badly injured, asked one of the passengers to put him out of his misery, to which the passenger declined. Most of the passengers that remained were severely injured as well, with many having broken limbs. By the end of the first night, 5 more people, including the co-pilot, had died from their injuries, bringing the total number of survivors down to 28. One of the passengers, Nando Parado, fell into a coma from the crash. Another, Enrique Platero, who was impaled by a metal structure in his abdomen. There were 2 medical students who had survived the crash, and they tended to survivors and checked them for any injuries as best they could. Many of the survivors noticed the search and rescue aircrafts flying above them, and they tried to write an SOS message on top of the plane with red lipstick. But there simply wasn't enough red lipstick available for them to write the message large enough for the aircraft to see, so they gave up. It's really easy when you're hearing about a story like this, and yeah, I totally do it too, to say, I'd do this or I'd do that, but you have to consider that these people were beyond cold. Like, think of the coldest you've ever been and add to that no end to that cold in sight. Many had broken every bone in their bodies or were extremely injured without any pain relief and were in shock from watching the people they loved die. For the rescuers, things looked bleak, and by the end of the week they'd concluded that all of the passengers must have died and thus ended their search after 142 hours of continuous searching. They hoped to find the bodies and give the victims a proper burial once the snow melted, not knowing there were dozens of survivors. Passengers were mainly using parts of the plane itself as shelter, pulling out the seats and using them as a bed. Cruelly, what they didn't know was that just 13 miles east of the crash site was an abandoned hotel. It was so cold that they had to close off the rear of the fuselage with luggage and remaining seats to prevent air from getting in. On the 3rd day of the crash, Parado finally woke up from his coma, only to find that his mother had died from the crash and only his sister survived but was extremely injured herself. She eventually died by the 8th day, bringing the number of survivors to 27. The remaining passengers were now living under extreme weather conditions they had never experienced before. The temperature at the crash site went to below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The passengers found a ray of hope as they found a small radio on the aircraft, and using the electrical cable of the plane, they formed a large antenna that allowed them to receive radio signals. It was through this they realized that the search for the crash was concluded after 11 days with no results, crushing the morale of the survivors. Within just 1 week, the survivors had run out of all the food on board and were desperate as there was no vegetation in the ice-cold conditions they were in. Out of sheer hunger, the survivors even started eating the cotton on the seats of the plane, which only made them vomit and retch their empty stomachs up. Eventually, they agreed with each other that if any one of them died, the survivors would be allowed to eat their bodies. And thus, many of the passengers started to eat the deceased victims of the crash, many of them their own friends and family. Again, in a totally detached way, it's easy to say that they did what they had to do, but can you imagine the difference between doing that in theory and in practice? Totally unimaginable. Initially, the majority of the survivors, deeply religious, refused to eat other humans, but as the situation got worse and it was clear no help was coming anytime soon, most of them were forced to concede that they had no other choice. They would often cut up pieces of flesh and leave it out in the sun to dry before consuming it. Parado notably did not let any of the passengers eat his mother and sister, and their bodies were protected. On October 29th, about 17 days after the crash, when things had already hit rock bottom, many of the survivors were sleeping in the body of the plane until an avalanche hit and killed 8 additional survivors. Among those dead included Marcelo Perez, who was considered the leader of the survivors, and Liliana Methal, who had acted as a mother figure to the survivors. This loss led to the others being even more disheartened, and their number was now down to 19. Many others were trapped in the plane with no air, and they slowly began to dig their way out to encounter a blizzard. What next? A volcano? There's no volcano in this story for your information, but you get where I'm coming from. And so the rest remained with no choice but to stay inside the plane and eat those who had died in the avalanche. As summer approached the southern hemisphere, the snow started to melt, and the passengers felt that it was an appropriate time to venture out and seek help nearby. They believed that the Chilean countryside must be a few kilometers west, even though they were much further than that. By November 15th, 3 more passengers died, bringing the total number of survivors down to 16. Survivors later learned on the radio that their search had been resumed due to the summer, which boosted their morale and hopes for survival. Eventually, an expedition was launched by the passengers consisting of Roberto Canessa, Parado, and Antonio Vicentin. They headed east, where they found the plane's tail section and within it some luggage containing extra food and shelter. They eventually figured out that the only way to escape the area was to climb over the mountain peak to the west. The 3 had no mountaineering experience or any equipment, but still set out to climb the 4,600-meter peak of Mount Seller. During the climb, which was taking much longer than expected, Vicentin concluded that it was a futile mission with only one possible outcome, and decided to return to the crash site while the other 2 went ahead. Upon reaching the summit, all they could see were snow-capped mountains, but eventually Parado saw some small peaks to the west that were green, and they regained hope. They saw a valley next to the mountain they were on, which approached those very peaks. After several days of hiking and trekking, they finally reached the valley where they found the source of the river that would lead them to safety. When they reached the river, they spotted 3 men on horseback and yelled out to them, although it was impossible for them to hear each other due to the loudness of the river. One of the men shouted, "Tomorrow," at them, and thank God he actually did return the next day. The anxiety of waiting for that must have been... When he did so, the survivors scribbled a note detailing who they were and threw it toward him. The man who found them and his friends ended up throwing the survivors some bread and rode a horse for the next 10 hours to bring some help. Eventually, the survivors crossed the river through a bridge and reached a road, where they were able to hitchhike on a truck to a nearby police station, where they told their story. Through the police station, they were able to alert the Chilean army, who had sent a rescue helicopter to save the remaining survivors at the crash site. Parado himself led the rescue operation and helped the helicopters find where the survivors were. On the 22nd of December 1972, the helicopters finally found the exact site and took in about half of those most injured survivors, coming back for the rest later due to altitude constraints. The rest were rescued the following day. What's perhaps the most insulting part of all was how the public briefly turned on the survivors, who had been, of course, hailed as heroes initially when they learned what they had done to those who had died to survive. But of course, common sense eventually prevailed. But if it came down to it, do you think you would do anything you had to survive? Let me know below in the comments. Until we speak again, sending you good vibes. Stay safe out there.